Forget the image of gleaming bronze shields and crimson cloaks fluttering under a heroic sun. The real Sparta was not built in marble arenas or on fields of glory. It was built in bedrooms stripped of intimacy and in nurseries ruled by fear. For the Spartans, the act that elsewhere meant love or passion was nothing more than a civic duty. The body was not a private possession, it was an instrument of the state. Desire was redefined as responsibility. What others called affection, Sparta called obedience. From the moment a child was conceived, it belonged not to its parents, but to the machinery of the city that had mastered the art of control. Every union began with a decree. Marriage was not an affair of hearts, but of measurements: height, strength, lineage, fertility. Magistrates old enough to have forgotten tenderness examined young men and women as if they were livestock. They compared shoulders, hips, bone structure, and breathing, seeking combinations that might yield the next generation of soldiers. Love was not forbidden, it was simply irrelevant. A family that produced weak children was an offence against the city. So Sparta took that choice away. The state became the matchmaker of destiny. The strong were paired with the strong, not for pleasure but for purpose. The rest could watch, serve, and obey. The women of Sparta were not cloistered in silence as they were in other Greek cities. They trained in the open fields, their limbs hardened by running, wrestling, and throwing the javelin. But their strength was not for themselves. It was preparation for pregnancy. They were told that their bodies were national property, their wombs factories for future warriors. The state convinced them that the glory of motherhood lay not in tenderness but in production. A woman's worth was measured in the vigour of her sons, not in the warmth of her love. They learned early that affection was a luxury too fragile for a world built on discipline. If a warrior's wife could not bear children, or if her children were weak, the solution was not compassion, but substitution. The state allowed and sometimes ordered another woman, proven strong and healthy, to conceive with him. The arrangement carried no shame, no secrecy. It was not adultery, because love had no jurisdiction here. It was civic duty. Husbands accepted it as honour. Wives endured it as law. The result was a society that turned biology into bureaucracy. A nation where the most intimate act was simply another transaction recorded in the ledger of strength. When birth finally came, it did not bring joy. The mother's tears were not of happiness but of dread. The newborn was taken from her arms and carried to a circle of elders, men who had long forgotten the softness of mercy. They inspected the infant as if it were an object forged in a workshop, turning it, weighing it, examining it for symmetry. Every muscle, every cry, every movement was a test. A perfect child was declared fit for Sparta. An imperfect one was taken away. There were no debates, no appeals, only the cold logic of survival. The condemned infants were carried to the foot of Mount Taygetus, to a place called the Deposits, where they were left to the wind and the wolves. The elders said it was not killing, merely returning defective material to nature. For them, mercy was a word that weakened the walls. Only strength deserved to live, because only strength could defend the city. The mothers did not wail. They had been taught that sorrow was disloyalty. Their grief was silent, buried under the same earth that claimed their children. The logic behind this cruelty was as old as fear. Sparta was a small city surrounded by enemies and built upon the labour of the Helots, serfs who outnumbered the citizens many times over. A single generation of weakness could mean extinction. In such a world, pity was treason. They had no philosophers to debate the value of life, only soldiers to defend it. Survival had replaced morality. The people became their own weapon, and every child was forged accordingly. At the age of 7, the next phase began. The boy was taken from his home, from the arms of the mother who had risked everything to bear him, and handed to the state. She did not cry. She reminded him of his duty. Come back with your shield or on it. It was not a metaphor. It was the single law of existence. From that moment on, the boy's family ceased to matter. His new home was the barracks, his new brothers were his unit, and his new father was the state itself. The first lesson was deprivation. The boys slept on beds of reeds they had to cut themselves from the riverbank. They wore a single cloak through winter and summer. Their meals were small by design. Hunger, they were told, sharpens the body and the mind. If they wanted more food, they were expected to steal it. If they were caught, the punishment was brutal, but not for the theft, only for being discovered. The rule was simple: failure was the only sin, success justified anything. They learned early that cunning was a virtue and weakness a crime. In this world, silence was power. Words were rationed like food. A boy who spoke carelessly was punished immediately. Questions were traps. Teachers expected answers that were short, clever, and fearless. A slow response invited pain. Hesitation was shame. From this came the word laconic, drawn from the land of Laconia, where every sentence was honed to a blade. The boys learned that thought should be quick, emotion invisible. They learned to suffer without sound and to smile beneath the whip. Pain was no longer an enemy but a tool. The older cadets ruled over the younger with the cruelty of the trained. It was not personal, it was policy. Each act of humiliation was a lesson in obedience. At mealtimes, the older boys fired questions like arrows. Who was the bravest man in Sparta? What was the greatest virtue? Could theft be noble? The answers mattered less than the composure of the speaker. The faintest stutter could provoke a blow. Fear was the invisible instructor in every corner of the barracks. Trust no one. Show no weakness. The lesson was endless and effective. Once a year their endurance was tested before the gods in the city. At the altar of Artemis Orthia, the boys had to snatch cheese placed upon the sacred stone, while priests and older youths lashed them with whips. To scream was disgrace. To collapse in silence was triumph. Witnesses said that some boys died under the lash without making a sound, smiling through blood as if pain were a medal. The crowd did not mourn them, they applauded. Sparta had no statues for poets or artists, but it remembered the names of those who bled without a cry. When a boy grew into a man, he entered the final stage, the secret one. The city's paranoia had birthed a ritual of darkness called the Crypteia. Each year, the rulers of Sparta declared a symbolic war against the Helots, the labourers who farmed their land. With that declaration, murder became legal. The most promising young men were sent into the countryside with nothing but a dagger, and orders to kill those helots deemed too strong, too clever, or too proud. They were to hide by day and hunt by night. It was not about extermination, it was about intimidation, it was about turning fear into policy. For the young killers, it was also a test. Could they end a life not in rage, but in duty? Could they kill for the idea of Sparta without hesitation or guilt? Those who returned were not celebrated. They were merely accepted, as if they had passed an invisible gate separating the human from the ideal Spartan. The city no longer had to command them. They had become the command itself. At 30, the soldier was allowed to live with a wife, though even this was an illusion of freedom. The wedding was a ritual stripped of romance. The woman's head was shaved. She was dressed in men's clothing and left waiting in a dark room. The husband would sneak away from his barracks, visit her briefly and return before dawn. The secrecy was deliberate. The state feared attachment more than adultery. A man who loved his wife might hesitate in battle. A man who desired her might abandon discipline. So intimacy was rationed like everything else. The women did not protest. They had been raised to believe that their wombs were as sacred as the city's walls. They knew that their purpose was to replenish the ranks that war and training constantly devoured. They were proud of their endurance, proud even of their pain. When their sons were taken at 7, they did not cling to them. They stood tall, telling them to come back victorious or not at all. In that moment, the state's work was complete. It had replaced the oldest human instinct, the bond between mother and child, with something colder and more useful, devotion to the collective. For centuries it worked. Sparta's warriors became the terror of the ancient world. They fought without fear, died without hesitation, and obeyed without question. But beneath the steel discipline and the triumphs on the battlefield, a slow erosion had begun. Every generation produced fewer citizens, every victory cost more than it could afford, and the same system that had built the strongest men in Greece was quietly consuming the nation that created them. What Sparta forged in its pursuit of perfection would, in time, become the weight that dragged it into silence. By the time Sparta reached the height of its glory, the cracks beneath its iron surface had already begun to widen. What had once been a society of pure purpose was turning into a system poisoned by its own perfection. The machine that had created the strongest warriors in history had also created the conditions for its own extinction. The same discipline that built the city now began to suffocate it. The laws that forged heroes could not forgive weakness, and the world beyond the mountains was changing faster than the Spartans could imagine. Their strength had been absolute, their ideals unbreakable, but perfection is a fragile thing. A single flaw, once invisible, can spread like rot beneath marble. For Sparta, that flaw was hidden in its obsession with purity. The very system that produced the most formidable soldiers also ensured that their numbers would never be enough. Every newborn was a gamble, every infant who survived inspection a future warrior. Yet every war, every battle, every ritual sacrifice thinned their ranks. The balance between birth and death had been too precise for too long, and as one generation bled out on the battlefield, another struggled to replace it. The population crisis began quietly, almost imperceptibly. The same eugenic laws that had made Sparta powerful began to betray it. Too many infants were left on the mountain. Too many mothers had died in childbirth. Too many fathers had fallen in foreign soil. The city that once commanded fear now faced a simpler, deadlier enemy: mathematics. For every generation of 300 who fought, fewer returned to father children. Every soldier was a monument to the past, but a void in the future. The citizens, once proud to call themselves equals, dwindled to a few thousand, then a few hundred. Even as the name of Sparta thundered through the world, its heartbeat was fading. The leaders of the city understood what was happening, but their answer was the same as always: more discipline, more control. They tightened the rules instead of loosening them. The system that had become too small tried to save itself by becoming even smaller. Foreigners were banned from marrying into Spartan bloodlines. Adoption was restricted. The definition of who could call himself a true Spartan narrowed until it became a death sentence. By guarding their purity, they ensured their extinction. While Sparta struggled to sustain its numbers, the rest of Greece was transforming. Athens, once mocked for its talk and philosophy, had become a laboratory of ideas. Corinth traded with distant lands. Thebes experimented with new forms of command. The world was learning to adapt, to invent, to question. Sparta, in contrast, stood still. The same discipline that had once been its strength turned into stubbornness. Innovation was treason. Change was weakness. A Spartan soldier could hold a line, but he could not imagine a new one. The Agora produced warriors who were unbreakable in battle but helpless in peace. Their entire lives had been devoted to fighting. When there was no war, they simply withered. They had no art, no philosophy, no economy beyond conquest. Even their language, once sharp as a spear, began to rust. Their minds had been trained for obedience, not creation. The world beyond their walls grew more sophisticated while they remained trapped in the simplicity of strength. They had built the perfect hammer, but history had already become a world of locks and keys. Then came victory, the cruelest gift of all. After decades of struggle, Sparta defeated Athens in the Peloponnesian War.